Hey everybody, Shoebox Legends here. Thanks for joining me today for another video response here on the channel. This one is going out to Sammy Thunder, who has a very successful and very cool YouTube channel that I, for some reason, I must have been living under a rock, but only learned about Sammy's channel recently, actually, as I started seeing all the responses for this VR contest pop up on a lot of the other channels that I follow. Went over and familiarized myself with Sammy Thunder, and he's awesome. I can definitely see why he's enjoyed a lot of success here on the platform, and he is throwing out what I think is a really fun VR. I've loved watching some of these from others, like Pepino Man and Dylan at Double D, Doug at Decon, and countless others, Ken at Ken's Cardboard. I just think this is a really cool concept, and basically what Sammy is looking for, he wants to see one pitcher and one hitter for each decade or era, going back all the way to pre-war, then 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Sammy is a vintage collector, so no real interest in going past the 80s, but that's enough of a challenge right there. And I wasn't sure how I'd do with this. Pre-war and maybe 70s are a little bit maybe my weaker points if I looked at my collection on the whole, but I was able to scrap something together that I think will suffice. So we'll start with pre-war and I'll work my way up. But here is my pitcher card for pre-war, the great Lefty Grove. This is my 1934 Diamond Stars in a lowly, crummy PSA 1 with a terrible, ugly-looking card. Can't believe I have this in my collection, but I do. But all kidding aside, it's a really cool card. I do not have a lot of playing era Lefty Groves, and as a Red Sox fan, doesn't get much better than him. I mean, I guess it does when you consider like Cy Young and Babe Ruth, but the Red Sox were pretty spoiled as far as pitching goes in the pre-war era, which is, 1940s and earlier. So decided to go with this Lefty Grove, which is part of my Red Sox team set that I did complete. So the Diamond Stars cards actually came out over a 3-year period between 1934 and 1936. And I have completed the Red Sox team set across those 3 years. Lefty Grove is probably the most important or best card in that team set. And it had been probably well over a year since I dug that one out and showed it off here on the channel, probably since showing that team set. So I figured that was a good choice for a pitcher. And then for a hitter, kind of chose this one just to stick with the same set that I had done for pitching, and went with this Kiki Kyler, also from Diamond Stars. And you can see that this is from the 1935 release. So again, this release spanned 3 years. This one was printed in the middle year, and features Kiki Kyler. It's a greenback, as indicated on the slab. Just means the summary is written up in green, but pretty cool. I have very minimal pre-war players to choose from that are like Hall of Fame caliber type guys. I do have quite a few pre-war cards that are just like commons because I love the way they look aesthetically, and I'm kind of fascinated by pre-war cards, but didn't have a lot to choose from as far as quality hitters. There was a couple I could have gone with, but one of the cards I want to save for another day. So Kiki Kyler it is. And now we'll move into the 1950s, and I'm kind of going to use this as an excuse to show off two of my favorite rookie cards in my collection. For the pitcher side of the house, this is a card that I only finally acquired earlier this year after a long time back in the hobby. I've always wanted this one, the rookie card of the great Sandy Koufax. Now, of course, the left arm of God had his best seasons in the 1960s with the Dodgers, but I want to say Sammy had something in his rules about, the player needing to be like drafted or debuting in the decade that you're showing them in. So I've slotted Sandy Koufax in here for the pitcher from the 1950s. So there's that one. And then to go with that, on the hitting side of the house, I have one of the, probably a top 10, certainly a top 10 and maybe a top 5 favorite card in my entire collection. I've shown it a couple times before, but it's the kind of card that you want to get some mileage out of, and this is a good excuse to do so. Hammer and Hank Aaron, my favorite player, at least as far as like retired veterans when I was a kid fan of the game. I read this guy's entire biography when I was in like 5th grade or 6th grade. It was a pretty tough, long read at the time for someone of that age, but I was really, really passionate about Hank Aaron. Just loved learning about him. I think his story is just awesome. His talent was immense, and obviously his rookie card is one of the more iconic baseball cards in existence in my mind. So Thought this was a good opportunity to use that one in the VR, and I've chosen Hank as my hitter from the 1950s. And we move now into the 60s. There were kind of three pitchers in my mind that are heads and tails above all the others in the 1960s, as far as that decade goes, and they are the aforementioned Sandy Koufax, Bob Gibson, and then this guy, Juan Marichel. And ended up choosing Juan Marichel because he's the only one of those three pitchers who debuted in the 60s. Of course, Gibson and Koufax got started in the 50s, as we talked about with Sandy. So Marichel seemed like the obvious choice for the 60s. Guy had, maybe the most solid decade overall, 1960 through 1969 collectively, of any pitcher. He's certainly in the mix, and always loved this beautiful 1964 Topps release. So pretty cool card there, and he is my pitcher from the 60s. Wanted to mix it up a little for the next card and not just choose like all big name players, but do something that was a little different and put my own spin on the VR as well. So for my hitter from the 1960s, I have a really intriguing story. It's the 1965 Topps Tony Conigliaro All-Star rookie card. His actual rookie was the year before, but this is his first standalone card with the All-Star rookie. Awesome card, and really interesting story, if a little depressing. But for those of you who aren't familiar with Tony Conigliaro, he broke onto the scene as a young star for the Red Sox and looked like he was the next big thing. He really seemed like the type of player who could be like a Carl Yastrzemski type player. He had it all. He hit for amazing power, was doing this in front of the Fenway crowd at a very young age, had multiple successful seasons in a row, really looked like he was on top of the world of baseball and poised to become an absolute superstar. And then tragically, he was hit right in the face, right in the eye with a pitch. I don't have it in front of me. I should have looked it up. I want to say it was during the 1967 season. And it was a horrific injury. If you look up pictures of this guy, his eye was swollen to like half the size of his face. And there were questions about whether there'd be long-term damage and, so on and so forth. He missed, I think, like an entire season of baseball or close to it. But amazingly, in a comeback story for the ages, he returned to the game. And while the injury definitely cost him the longevity that he would have had in the game, and he ended up out of baseball at a much earlier age than he would have, he did nonetheless have a couple of really, really good seasons. I think 1970 in particular, he clubbed like over 30 home runs, over 100 RBI, hit for average. Like he just was an absolute monster. Shortly after that, he kind of deteriorated quickly. He was out of the game, and then tragically, he actually passed away at a very early age from a health condition that I don't recall if it was related or not. I don't think it was, but died at a very young age. And so sort of became a tragic, what might have been story. And it's certainly well remembered here in the New England area and by Red Sox fans. And you just have to wonder, had that pitch been aimed a little differently or not injured him in that season, what might have been and what his career numbers potentially would have looked like. We'll never know. But I think he's an intriguing player, and when you look at his stats and what he was doing both before and after that injury, and I think this is a really cool vintage card to pick up that doesn't cost a lot of money and has got that great rookie cup as well. So that's my hitter from the 60s. Moving into the 70s, I was a little weak on pitching here, so I don't have a slabbed card. I've got this one though. Was sort of caught up by the player must have debuted in that decade rule. So I wanted to go with Nolan Ryan, but he debuted in 69. Other guys like Carlton and Seaver and a lot of these powerhouse pitchers of the 70s had already debuted the decade prior. So ended up settling on this Dennis Eckersley. So great player, fan favorite here around Boston for the time that he spent with the team. And then in recent years doing color commentary work for the Red Sox TV broadcasts. Just an awesome guy, great sense of humor, Hall of Famer. And this is just a really nice 1970s Kellogg's lenticular 3D card. Really, really love these cards that I think started in the late 60s and went all the way to the early 80s and beyond. Just think those are really fun. And I thought, Eckersley would be a nice sort of Boston flair and an interesting card to go for my pitcher in the 1970s for this VR. Moving along, we have my hitter for the 1970s, and this is a card I've shown somewhat recently, Robin Yount, on a beautiful 1976 Topps. This thing looks, pack fresh practically, like it just spilled out of the wrapper. And Yount is sort of a undersung as much as he can be for a Hall of Famer hitter that originated in the 70s. Of course, his 75 rookie card is his most famous and sought after card. But I just thought this example of his second year, 1976, is so nice that it deserved to see the light of day again. So chose that one for the 70s. And then last but not least, we move into the 80s. And I got to unwrap this first one here. But pitching was a little bit of a challenge here as well, because again, wanted to stick with that rule of, player must have debuted during the decade. And so I'm going with a choice that I've seen a couple other people go with. In my opinion, it's either maybe him or Roger Clemens. And I'm aware of the asterisk with Clemens, but it's either this guy or Clemens maybe that are probably the best two pitchers career-wise to debut during the 80s. Greg Maddox, the Chicago Cubs, and shows his Fleer update rookie card, which I've always liked just because of the matching blue of the 87 Fleer design and the Chicago Cubs uniform. Even though it's not the same blue, I do think it ties the card together nicely, and it's a cool kind of post-delivery shot there of a very skinny Greg Maddox in the early days of his career with Chicago before he was just racking up Cy Young Awards and won a World Series championship with the Braves the following decade in the 90s. So that's my choice for the 80s for a pitcher. And then for hitter, was tempted to go with Rickey Henderson, but again, he played some games in 1979, so switched it up a little bit and went with a card that was a absolute favorite of mine in my youth, and I still love it to this day. The 1982 Topps Cal Ripken Jr. plus Bob Bonner and Jeff Schneider rookie card, Future Stars. This was probably the single most prized card in my childhood collection growing up. I got a vending box of 1982 Topps baseball for my birthday when I was maybe 11 or 12, and did pull a single Cal Ripken Jr. rookie card out of that vending box. I still have it. This is not that card. This is a graded one that I picked up later on for the collection, but I do still have my original, and just always loved this card, always loved the man himself. I admire his work ethic and the record that he set, which is, essentially what I try to model in my own career, which is, showing up every day and giving it your best is kind of half the battle. And it's a little bit cheesy, but when I was a kid, I kind of tried to take something from that and kind of model myself consistency-wise after Cal Ripken, and it's a set of values that has done well for me in life, and that I'm happy that I developed at an early age, that sense of work ethic and commitment. And Cal Ripken Jr. and this card was a big part of that when I was growing up. So that is my choice for 1980s hitter, and that will wrap up the overall VR for Sammy Thunder. Really appreciate you putting this on, Sammy. It's a super cool contest, great prizes, and best of all, it was just an excuse for me to get to know you and become aware of your channel. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope everyone else that stopped by to check it out enjoyed it as well. I've really liked watching all of yours. If you'd still like to do one of these, I think there's time to get in. But whether or not you make the cut, it is a fun exercise to go through your collection and pick out a hitter and pitcher from each era or each decade. Had a blast doing this. So thank you, Sammy. Thanks to everybody else. And I'll be back in the very near future with some more sports card content. Until then, take care and enjoy the hobby.